This is John 17, 13 through 21. Now, I am coming to you. I told them many things while I was with them in this world, so that they would be filled with my joy. I have given them your word, and the world hates them because they do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. I'm not asking you to take them out of the world, but to keep them safe from the evil one. They do not belong to this world any more than I do. Make them holy by your truth. Teach them your word, which is truth. Just as you sent me into the world, I am sending them into the world. And I give myself as a holy sacrifice for them, so that they can be made holy by your truth. I am praying not only for these disciples, but also for all who will ever believe in me through their message. I pray that they will all be one, just as you and I are one, as you are in me, Father, and I am in you, and may they be in us, so that the world will believe you sent me. This is the word of the Lord.
This is our fifth and final week in our series on blessing. It's been a series where I have tried to track this theme of God pouring out his goodness in all of creation as that theme develops through the great sweep of the Bible. And I've tried to convince us, I don't know how I've done, but I've tried to convince us that this is at the heart of God's character. And so too, it is integral to what God beckons his followers to do and to be in all the world. Over the course of this series, we've gone fairly deep on a few passages, and today is not that. Today, we're going to begin in John 17, the passage that Sam just read for us, but then I'm going to give you three glimpses, three portraits, if you will, of Jesus' followers who have been a blessing in the world in different ways over the past few centuries. Some of their stories will be known to some of you, but I want you to hear me here. My goal isn't just that you learn stories. If you want to find out more about these people, you can come and I'll give you biographies and autobiographies. But my goal is that instead of taking notes so much, the walls of our hearts would get pushed out a little farther. I'm hoping that we will begin to exercise holy imagination for how God might be beckoning us and you to be a blessing in Baltimore or beyond in ways that leave breadcrumbs that point back to God. First, two very brief observations from the passage that Sam read for us. Here's the first one in just a moment. Context, John 17, according to John, is the prayer that Jesus prays the night of his betrayal. He's pouring out to his heart to his Father, and he's praying on behalf of his followers there who might be in the room with him, but also us, everyone who will come to be a follower of Jesus through the testimony of those disciples. We did a brief series on that prayer back in October. If you want to track that down, it's on the pod. Here's the first observation. Jesus expects that his disciples will be filled with joy while still in the world. Verse 13 is where he says this. I told them many things so that they would be filled with joy. This is interesting, given the context, the night of his betrayal. Jesus' expectation for us isn't that we would be morose. It's not that we would be giddy. It's not that we would be triumphalistic or Pollyanna or optimistic or depressed. It is that his disciples would be filled with joy, which I think you'll hear this morning is something more durable. Just a few chapters from here, he'll have a conversation with Peter in which he alludes to the fact that he knows full well the lives of these followers he's praying for will encounter much pain and difficulty, even to the point of death. Here's a big reason that their lives are going to be hard, because they are still in the world. That's what he says. When Jesus uses that word world, cosmos, in John's gospel, it's not meaning world like we often use world. He doesn't mean planet Earth. He doesn't mean culture at large. He doesn't mean just existing. When Jesus uses that word, John uses that word in his gospel. He's usually using it to refer to human life without God, or human life set in opposition to the God of the Bible. John uses it in a very different way than the other gospel writers. He's referring to a world as, if I can put it this way, life outside the garden. He's referring to world as a life that is resisting and running from God's blessing. He's using world to refer to life that is rejecting a relationship with the source of blessing. So Jesus' expectation, if you get this, is that his followers will be sustained by joy, they'll be filled by joy, but they will still be immersed in a world that is rejecting the source of blessing. Does that make sense? Yes. If I could get super concrete for a moment, it means that Jesus knows Peter will joyfully go to an upside-down crucifixion because he's sustained by the love of Jesus and motivated by a desire that people whose only experience is world, is rejection of blessing, will, through Peter, encounter the source of blessing. Does that make sense? The idea of joy despite or through pain is going to run right the way through our portraits this morning. Here's the second observation. Jesus' followers do not belong to this world. Yeah. Remember how he uses the word world. Verse 14, Jesus says, they, my followers, meaning his followers there in the room with him presumably, but also us, do not belong to the world just as I do not belong to the world, which begs this question, well, where do we belong then? Is it 1950s America? Is it Reformation Europe? Is it Christianized Mediterranean basin? No, we don't belong to any previous world. Followers of Jesus belong to a world that is still being born. This is how one early Christian letter from the 2nd century puts it. They, followers of Jesus, spend their existence upon the earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. They obey the established laws, but their own lives surpass the laws. They love all men, but are persecuted by all. They are poor, and yet they make many rich. They lack everything, and yet in everything they abound. They are dishonored, and their dishonor becomes their glory. They are abused, and yet they bless. You're going to see this theme borne out this morning. So by our joy-fueled, sacrificial lives, Jesus followers get to conspire with the Trinitarian God of the Bible to birth a new world, a new heavens, in which the blessing of God permeates every nook and cranny and cupboard and crack. That is our calling. Some of you will notice that this series would probably 2 decades ago have been called a missions series. You'll also notice that I've studiously tried to avoid phrases like, go tell all of your friends about Jesus because that is our Christian duty. It's not that that would be wrong, it's just that that doesn't really work from preachers in 2025. But also, the authors of the New Testament don't major on that. They don't major on being a blessing out of duty. Listen to the late Anglican missionary Leslie Newbigin. He says, there's been a long tradition which sees the mission of the church primarily as obedience to a command. It's been customary to speak of the missionary mandate. This way of putting the matter is certainly not without justification, but it seems to me it misses the point. It tends to make mission a burden rather than a joy. If one looks at the New Testament evidence, this is on the screen for you, one gets another impression. Mission begins with a kind of explosion of joy. The news that the rejected and crucified Jesus is alive is something that cannot possibly be suppressed. It must be told. Who could stay silent about such a fact? The mission of the church in the pages of the New Testament is more like the fallout from a vast explosion, a radioactive fallout which is not lethal but life-giving. Radioactive fallout that's not lethal but life-giving. I love that. Earlier this week, I was chatting with Zach Mearkreebs. Some of you know his name, so I'm dropping it, as the guest speaker who preached at the Asbury University Chapel the morning that the Asbury Outpouring began. The Asbury Outpouring was a special event that lasted 16 days on this university campus where the Holy Spirit showed up in a unique way, and students stayed around the clock for 16 days, worshiping, confessing their sin, praising God in very non-flashy ways. And over the course of those 2 weeks, estimates are that up to 70,000 people from around the world came to see what God was doing. As you'd expect, Zach's life changed pretty dramatically as a result of those events. And one change was that the university brought him on to help figure out what to do with all of the students who suddenly switched majors. He told me that 400 students switched majors as a result of that 2 weeks to study missions or to prepare for ministry. Here's what I'm saying. There was an explosion of joy among students that came from experiencing God's goodness in a profound way, and it was such a profound thing that the university had to rethink their infrastructure in order to accommodate these trajectory changes. Some of you are in higher ed. You know it would change something if 400 students switched majors mid-semester. For remaining minutes, I want to give you 3 portraits. People whose lives had experienced the goodness of God, and it drove them to be a blessing despite profoundly painful events. And I'm not going to go deep in those details, but here's a heads up. We're going to be talking about child loss and racism and parent loss and bullying. These are people just like you, just like me, who are in the world, but not of it. And the world that these people left behind was tinged with blessing. I hope that that kindles holy imagination among us this morning. Here's the first one. Richard Allen. Richard Allen was born into enslavement not far from here in the state of Delaware in 1760. He was a young man when a visiting preacher came to the farm where he worked, and part of this visiting preacher's ministry was to convince plantation owners of the injustice of enslavement and to allow the enslaved people to purchase their freedom. And that is what happened on Richard's farm. He did so, he purchased his own freedom, and he soon became a preacher in the fledgling Methodist movement in the United States. He was here in this city, in what used to be the old Lovely Lane United Methodist. Some of you know Lovely Lane, 4 blocks from here. He was in the old Lovely Lane United Methodist Church on 1784 for the Christmas conference when Methodism in the United States was born. That's what the date that it's founded to, here in Baltimore. Methodist churches, Methodist Episcopal churches as they were called at the time, were sort of officially integrated places, but in reality, they were far from that. Some of you know the story. The African Americans were often relegated to balcony seating or seating at the back or to standing, all in buildings that they had helped to pay for. Eventually, more details. Richard was a very gifted preacher. He would often draw large crowds in open-air settings, but when it came to preaching in these churches, he was relegated to the 5 a.m. slot. It was a death of 1,000 paper cuts, a rejection after rejection after rejection. Paper cuts sounds dismissive. It was a death of 1,000 stabs. Eventually, when Allen and other black members of their church were required to give up their seats in the balcony for some wealthy white worshipers, he walked out and led 42 others to create the first African American denomination in this country. It became known as the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Broader context, many of us don't know this period of our own American history. This 10-year period coming out of the Revolution was a period where there were major advancements for towards improved conditions for black Americans. And almost all of them were erased within a decade. The abolitionist movement picked up momentum coming out of the Revolution. The Methodist General Conference in 1780, 1783, and 84 passed legislation condemning slavery and prohibiting any Methodist from participating in it. Just a few years later, the General Committee of the Virginia Baptists condemned slavery as a violent deprivation of the rights of nature. And then black Christians began to rework, this is clever, rework Puritan sermons pointing to injustices of white Christianity. That was smart. But when the momentum came to the southern colonies, it sputtered out. The Methodists backed down. They suspended their anti-slavery legislation. The Virginia Baptists punted legislation to individual conscience, and the majority opted for better treatment for enslaved people. But they left the institution of slavery intact. And in that sense, against their own conscience, the church protected an institution that they lacked the backbone to abolish. The picture I'm trying to paint is a succession of one step forward and two steps back, a series of disappointment. It's after this decade of deepening rejection that Bishop Allen finds himself called upon by his white neighbors for help. The 1793 yellow fever sweeps through Philadelphia, where he is at the time. Philadelphia is at the time the home of the national government. And in just a course of a few weeks, 5,000 people, in a population of 30,000 at the time, that's 17%, die as a result of yellow fever. A lot of the wealthy people, a lot of the white residents, they do the equivalent of telecommuting. They go to Zoom towns outside the city. And Bishop Allen and Bishop Absalom Jones and some others led a citywide effort to provide nursing, to provide sanitation, to provide burial services, all at their own great cost. Probably the most galling injury of this was afterwards, fellow citizens came and accused Philadelphia's black church community of profiteering and plundering during this outbreak. This is the pictures. They've served sacrificially through the pandemic, and then Richard Allen and his colleagues are forced to pull out their own records to show, this is what the record showed, that the city's black organizations had spent nearly twice what they had received in serving their city through this crisis. Blessing, 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 out of deep pain. For Bishop Allen and for Christians through the centuries, this impetus to love our neighbors and even to love our enemies comes from, it's fueled by something deeper than our emotions. It comes from the love of Christ. Listen to how Bishop Allen puts it. Whoever loves desires the welfare and happiness of the beloved object, but thou, O dear Jesus, canst receive no addition from my imperfect services. Jesus, I can't do anything that makes your life better. So what shall I do to express my affection towards thee? I will relieve the necessities of my poor brethren, who are members of your body. For he that loveth not his brother who he has seen, how can he love the God whom he has not seen? Second portrait, Josephine Butler. Butler, whose dates are 1828 to 1906, was raised in a wealthy British family. She was bright, she was well-educated, she was politically engaged, but it was after experiencing heartbreaking loss that her life sort of bloomed outward in blessing for others, especially for strangers. She and her husband had just returned from vacation with their 4 young kids to home. And the parents were about to go out for the evening. And their youngest, their only daughter, Eva, popped into the room to show her mom a caterpillar that she had caught. And as I'm sure every parent can relate to, she brushed Eva off, lovingly, but a brush off nonetheless. Now trot away, for I am late for tea, she records. Words that one biographer says would haunt her for the rest of her life. Kids were awake when the couple got home later that evening, and they rushed from their bedrooms on the top floor to greet the parents, and Eva somehow fell over the banister, at least 2 floors to a tiled hallway below. After agonizing few hours, their beloved and only daughter was dead. And the coroner's report, which confirmed the accidental death, contained this mortifying detail. For the attention of Mr. George Butler, please ensure that the faulty top floor banisters are repaired. I'm afraid to try to imagine their pain. So began an excruciating and inward season for that couple. She would refer to it later as a drought of her soul. Some of you have experienced pain like this firsthand, and she writes about it this way. That dark passage through which some toil only to emerge into hopeless and final denial of the divine goodness, the complete bankruptcy of faith, and others, by the mercy of God, through a still deeper experience into a yet firmer trust of his unfailing love. Heartbreak, injustice, these things can harden our hearts toward God and each other, or they can open our hearts by God's mercy toward God and each other. It was in this drought of the soul that she learned to send her roots deep and to be sustained in prayer. And this is where she found a nourishment that was inexhaustible. It ripened in her into a resolve to do what she could to improve the lives of people around her, many of whom were strangers, and in particular women. One of her first targets became the Contagious Diseases Act. This was a series of acts that Parliament passed in the end of the 19th century. They were designed to cut down on STIs in the Royal Navy. But they left all the responsibility on the supply side of the equation and did nothing on the demand side of the equation, which was the Royal Navy. The government winked at the sailors who were demanding, and it enforced dehumanizing and dangerous examinations on the commercial sex workers. Butler was opposed to all of this, to the practice and to the way it was being enforced because of her faith. And so she began to advocate and educate and campaign tirelessly. And her advocacy enabled many women to get out of that industry and eventually led to the repeal of these acts. There's an astounding new biography out of her called When Courage Calls. She was a tremendously energetic author. She wrote over 90 books and pamphlets in her lifetime. She turned her pen to poverty. She was one of the early pioneers of women's suffrage in the UK, but has since mainly been written out of this storyline. And everything in her life was fueled by prayer. She uses 2 phrases that I think could well sum up her legacy. They're this: a spirit of vicarious suffering. She knew what it was to suffer, and she was able to suffer with and on behalf of others. Because of her pain, she was poignantly connected to others who were in pain. And the second one is this: a grace of perpetual intercession. She writes at some point in one of her books, "Oh, that I had 1,000 tongues, that I could constantly implore the Lord on behalf of all the," and then she begins to list injustices. Some of you have this gift, and some of you are being called into this grace, the grace of perpetual intercession. And probably it's not because your life has been easy. You may be a blessing and leave a legacy of a world around you tinged by the goodness of God because of vicarious suffering and perpetual intercession. Here's the last one. Many of you will know this name, C.S. Lewis, best known as the author of delightful children's stories, The Chronicles of Narnia. If what you know of Lewis is The Chronicles of Narnia, you might expect that he had a happy childhood filled with imaginative play. But that was not the case. I once heard J.I. Packer, who overlapped with Lewis at Oxford, say this in his understated British way. In Lewis's life, there was a great deal of pain. He lost his mother to cancer when he was 9 or 10. His relationship with his father was very hard. One of the biographers, if I recall, says that the father was so controlling and stifling, he eradicated all individuality. Lewis was sent off to a succession of boarding schools. Great education, but very difficult environment. He was regularly bullied, he was often lonely, and he was witness to lots of harsh treatment. And he walked away from his childhood faith. He went on to serve in the First World War in the trenches, and he made a pact there with his wartime buddy, Paddy Moore, that if either of them made it out of the trenches alive, that one would care for the surviving parents of the other. Lewis would go on to uphold this pact and to grieve his friend. It was in his early 30s while he was teaching at Oxford that he returned to his Christian faith, and he details that in his book called Surprised by Joy. Here's how he records it. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed, and perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. He tells the story of this being pursued by joy, a sense of joy, this nostalgic longing for a world that was still to be born fully. And that is what led him back to faith and to his subsequent experience of the goodness of God. Some of you have read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you'll know the setting there is 4 kids who go to a big country house during wartime where there's an older professor. That wasn't so much imagination as that was reality. He never made a lot of money as an academic. Some of you academics know what that's like. But he and his brother pooled their resources and bought a largish house on the outside of Oxford, where he housed his brother or his friend Warnie's mom and sister and cared for them both for the rest of the mother's life. They also took in several groups of school-aged children during the war to protect them from the bombing raids that were happening in the urban centers. At this point in his life, his platform is growing, his books are getting well known, he's speaking on the BBC radio during the war. And books like the Screwtape Letters are being released sort of serially through the periodicals. So royalty money starts to pour in, especially once Narnia lands in America. But he never upscaled his life. He continued to live very simply. I don't think he ever purchased a car. And this was intentional. Listen to how he puts it in Screwtape Letters. Prosperity knits a man to the world. He feels that he is finding his place in it, while really it is finding its place in him. The extravagance that could have easily crept in, he reserved that extravagance not for himself, but for generosity. So he got his fellow inkling and writer, Owen Barfield, who was also an attorney, to set up a trust fund, a charitable fund called Agape, the word for God's never-ending, never giving up, always persevering love. And through that fund, he gave away gobs of money to serve the poor, to help underfunded churches, to care for clergy widows, to fund seminary students, and a whole range of other worthy needs. And he always made sure that his name stayed out of the limelight. He died the same day as JFK with hardly any money to his name. He had been generous. He had given the world Narnia and other great books, but also unseen, he had given away vast, vast sums of money. No doubt, living out his own words from Mere Christianity. Here's what he says. I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I'm afraid the only safe rule for Christians is to give more than we can spare. In other words, if our expenditure on comforts, luxuries, amusement, etc., is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we are probably giving away too little. Oof. If our giving does not at all pinch or hamper us, I should say it is too small. There ought to be things we should like to do and cannot because our commitment to giving excludes them. Wow. Wow. I'll invite the worship team to come back up as I begin to close for us. These are three people who experienced some of the same hardships that many of you have experienced, and you have others that are not reflected in their lives. And yet, in and through their experience of living in the world, their roots went deep into a subterranean aquifer of the goodness of God. And by that, they were sustained. Paul writes to the Colossians in chapter 2, he says, in the same way as you have received Jesus, now walk in him. Send your roots down deep in him. Build the house of your life up tall in him. This is how we bless the world. As the worship team leads us in a moment here, there will be prayer ministers over by the banners. If you would like to pray, maybe I've touched a nerve in your life and you need someone to just speak the balm of the Lord over you and pray for God's comfort. Or maybe you feel the Lord stirring your heart toward being a blessing. Maybe you want to be called to courage. Maybe you want the Spirit of God to highlight for you ways that you could be a blessing in your current life and circumstances. But this is my longing for this community and the churches of Baltimore, that we would be little outcroppings of the goodness of God in this city, leaving breadcrumbs that point our friends and neighbors and even our enemies back to him. So during this last worship set, if you want to make use of the prayer ministers, they'll be over there by the banners. You can make your way over there at any point. Otherwise, would you stand and worship? I'll pray. Father, come among us by your Spirit, and do by your Spirit in us what I can't do with words. Would you spark and fan into flame holy imagination for how we can conspire with you, the triune God, the reality at the center of the universe. Could you help us to conspire with you, birthing a new world that is permeated by your blessing? I pray this in Jesus' name, for his glory.